Beneath the soil of Iraq, whole cities sleep in fragments. Their walls are broken. Their temples are buried. Their gods survive in tablets cracked by fire, war, and time. Mesopotamia did not leave us one neat book of mythology. It left ruins, names without faces, stories with missing lines, kings who claimed divine favor, then vanished into mud. And from these damaged pieces, we try to reconstruct a world where the gods were not comforting symbols, but terrifying powers watching from above, below, and everywhere in between. So we begin carefully, not with certainty, but with fragments, a shard of clay, a half-preserved hymn, a myth copied by a scribe who may never have seen the city where it first began. Mesopotamian mythology is not a single doorway. It is a buried street, uncovered one room at a time. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. Long before Greece imagined Olympus, long before later scriptures shaped the language of creation and flood, the people between the Tigris and Euphrates were already asking dangerous questions. Why do humans suffer? Why do cities fall? Why do gods demand worship, labor, blood, and obedience? Their answers were written into clay, baked by accident, buried by collapse, and read again thousands of years later by strangers. What rises from those tablets is not a dead religion exactly. It is something more unsettling, a record of human beings trying to live beneath powers they believed could make the world, break it, and leave no explanation behind. Chapter 2. A Land Between Rivers and Worlds. To understand the gods of Mesopotamia, we have to begin with the land itself. A broad, difficult plain held between two rivers that gave life, took life, and rarely explained themselves. The Tigris and Euphrates were not gentle background scenery. They were the great argument at the center of existence. They could feed a city, drown a field, shift a boundary, ruin a harvest, or leave cracked earth behind where grain should have grown. The people who lived between them learned early that survival depended on attention. Water had to be watched. Canals had to be cut, cleared, defended, repaired. Mud had to be shaped into walls, houses, tablets, and temples. Civilization here was not built against nature exactly, but in negotiation with it, and nature did not always keep its side of the bargain. That matters because mythology is never only imagination. It grows from pressure. In Mesopotamia, pressure came from rivers, heat, labor, hunger, kings, enemies, and the unsettling knowledge that a city could look permanent in the morning and vulnerable by nightfall. When people imagined divine power, they did not imagine it as soft or sentimental. They imagined it as immense, necessary, and dangerous. The gods were not absent from the world. They were woven into it. A storm could be weather, but it could also be anger. A failed harvest could be bad luck, poor irrigation, or the sign that some divine obligation had been neglected. A king's victory could prove divine favor, at least until his defeat suggested the favor had moved elsewhere. This did not make Mesopotamians irrational. It made them people trying to read a world where the difference between survival and collapse could be terrifyingly thin. There is a common misunderstanding that ancient people invented gods simply to explain what science had not yet explained. That is too small a reading. Mesopotamian religion was not just an answer to thunder or flood. It was a way of living inside uncertainty. The question was not only, why did the river rise? It was, what does the rising demand from us? A canal, a sacrifice, a prayer, a royal decree, a ritual purification, a new wall, a new treaty. All of these belong to the same anxious effort to keep order from slipping. And order was hard work. Cities like Uruk, Ur, Nippur, Eridu, Babylon, Nineveh, and many others did not float above the landscape as isolated monuments. They depended on grain, labor, storage, scribes, irrigation networks, temple estates, and political control. The city was a machine made of mud brick and belief. Its heart was often the temple, not simply as a religious building, but as a center of economy, administration, identity, and cosmic orientation. The god of a city was not a decorative patron. The god was, in a sense, the true owner. The people lived on land that belonged ultimately to divine authority. The king ruled, but he did not rule alone. He ruled under a gaze he could never fully control. This is one reason Mesopotamian myths often feel less comforting than later moral tales. The gods are powerful, but not always just in the way a modern reader might expect. They can be wise, creative, protective, and generous. They can also be proud, irritated, remote, jealous, or alarmingly practical. They may create human beings, but not necessarily out of love. They may preserve order, but order can require violence. They may hear prayers, yet remain silent. The divine world resembles the human political world in certain ways. Layered, hierarchical, full of rivalry, duty, status, and unpredictable decisions made above one's head. That similarity was not accidental. In a land of competing city-states and later empires, power was experienced as something both necessary and dangerous. A ruler could protect irrigation systems, organize labor, defend walls, and bring prosperity. A ruler could also demand too much, anger the gods, lose a war, or turn a city into a ruin. So when Mesopotamians imagined heaven, they did not imagine a peaceful democracy of spirits. They imagined a court. There were high gods, lesser gods, messengers, gatekeepers, scribes, judges, warriors, and terrifying beings who moved along the edges of order. The cosmos had administration. Even the sky could feel bureaucratic. Yet beneath that almost dry observation lies something deeply human. If the universe has a court, then perhaps a petition can be made. If signs can be read, perhaps danger can be anticipated. If a god is angry, perhaps anger can be cooled. Mesopotamian religion was filled with rituals not because people thought life was simple, but because they knew it was not. Ritual gave form to fear. Divination gave grammar to uncertainty. Myth gave memory to catastrophe. The rivers taught this lesson again and again. Unlike the idealized image of a predictable paradise, southern Mesopotamia required collective discipline. Irrigation could increase abundance, but it also created dependence. Canals silted up. Fields could become damaged by salt. Neighboring communities could quarrel over water. A broken canal was not just an engineering problem. It was a threat to food, labor, authority, and divine favor all at once. The environment rewarded cooperation, but it also created competition. This tension shaped the imagination of the region. Creation was precious because chaos was never far away. When later myths speak of primeval waters before the world, they are not merely offering an abstract image. Water was the condition before order, and also the force always waiting outside it. Too little water meant famine. Too much meant destruction. Properly channeled, water became grain, beer, cities, writing, kingship. Uncontrolled, it returned the world to mud. In Mesopotamia, civilization was what happened when water obeyed a boundary. The same could be said of divine power. A god's strength had to be honored, directed, appeased, housed, praised. Temples were not just symbols reaching upward. They were places where divine presence was managed with care. The deity needed offerings, music, clothing, ritual attention. To modern ears, this may sound strange, as if the gods were being treated like kings. But that is exactly the point. Kings, too, had to be approached through protocol. Power required service. Access was never casual. This gives Mesopotamian mythology its distinctive emotional temperature. It is not cold, but it is rarely relaxed. The myths often move under the weight of obligation. Humans exist in a crowded cosmos, beneath beings older and stronger than themselves. The world can be intelligible, but not always kind. It can be ordered, but not always safe. Even wisdom does not free a person from mortality. Even kings must die. Even cities beloved by their gods can fall. And still the people built. That may be the most important detail. Mesopotamian myth is filled with fear of divine power, but it is not a literature of surrender. Again and again, we find people trying to act, building walls, founding cities, copying tablets, performing rituals, asking questions, arguing with fate in the only languages available to them. Their gods may be distant, but human beings are not passive. They work, plead, interpret, remember. They turn river mud into writing, and writing into a fragile kind of survival. So when we look at the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, we are not just looking at a setting. We are looking at the first great character in the story. The land shaped the fears. The rivers shaped the metaphors. The cities shaped the heavens. The instability of life shaped a divine world where power was real, order was temporary, and every human achievement stood between blessing and ruin. From that uneasy landscape, the oldest questions begin to rise. Before the city, before the temple, before kings and scribes and offerings, what was there? The Mesopotamians answered with water, not as scenery, but as the deep, restless beginning from which gods, worlds, and human trouble would eventually emerge. Chapter 3. Before the beginning. The primeval waters. Before the first wall was raised, before the first king placed his name before the gods, before a scribe pressed a reed into wet clay and made memory visible, Mesopotamian imagination looked backward into water. Not a blue sea under a calm sky, not a romantic ocean with a horizon, something older than scenery, a depth without streets, borders, fields, or names. Water before order. Water before separation. Water before the world had been divided into above and below. This is one of the most powerful ideas in Mesopotamian creation thought, but also one of the easiest to oversimplify. There was no single official creation story, that every city and every century repeated in exactly the same way. The myths we have are scattered across languages, periods, and political settings. Sumerian traditions do not always match later Akkadian or Babylonian versions. Some texts preserve only hints. Some begin after the most mysterious moment has already happened. Others reshape cosmic origins to honor a particular god or city. So when we speak of the Mesopotamian beginning, we should speak with care. We are not opening a finished theology. We are listening to several ancient voices, some clear, some broken, all trying to describe how order emerged from what had no order at all. In many traditions, the beginning is imagined through waters: fresh water from the deep, salt water from the sea, underground abundance, chaotic flood, fertile source. These meanings overlap, but they are not identical. Water could nourish a field or swallow it. It could carry boats, fill canals, and make cities possible. It could also erase the line between all. No wonder the earliest condition of existence was imagined not as empty space, but as a kind of undivided, watery potential. In later Babylonian tradition, especially in the great creation epic often known by its opening words, Enuma Elish, the universe begins with mingled waters. Apsu, associated with the fresh waters, and Tiamat, associated with the salt sea. From them, generations of gods emerge. The story is dramatic, political, and violent, and it will matter deeply when Babylon rises in the imagination of empire. But even there, beneath the conflict and royal theology, the older intuition remains. Before the world becomes a world, it is fluid, unstable, unmeasured. The world has to be separated before it can be inhabited. That idea appears in different forms. Heaven and earth are not always treated as eternally distinct. In some Sumerian materials, the cosmos begins with a more unified condition, and only later do heaven and earth become divided. An, the sky, and Kai, the earth, stand at the root of divine and cosmic structure. The details are not always preserved as neatly as we might wish, but the direction of thought is clear enough. Creation means making distinctions: above from below, dry land from water, divine space from human space, city from wilderness, temple from ordinary ground. To a modern reader, creation is often imagined as making something out of nothing. That is not usually the Mesopotamian emphasis. Their myths are more concerned with shaping, arranging, naming, assigning, and controlling. Existence is already thick with divine forces before human order appears. The question is not simply, how did matter begin? It is, how did the dangerous fullness of reality become structured enough for life, kingship, ritual, and labor? This difference matters. It changes the emotional meaning of creation. In these myths, order is not effortless. It must be established. Sometimes it must be fought for. Sometimes it must be negotiated among gods whose interests do not perfectly align. Creation is not a peaceful decoration of a blank universe. It is the imposition of boundaries on something older, deeper, and resistant. That may be why Mesopotamian creation stories often feel less like bedtime origins and more like political memories projected onto the cosmos. The gods organize the universe the way cities organize land. They assign roles, they establish ranks, they claim authority, they build dwellings, they distribute powers. Even nature itself becomes part of a hierarchy. The cosmos, like the city, must be administered. And yet the primeval waters never entirely disappear. This is the quiet tension at the center of the Mesopotamian worldview. Creation does not destroy chaos once and for all. It restrains it. It gives it edges. The waters remain beneath, around, and beyond the ordered world. The flood can return. The deep can rise. The boundary can fail. A canal can break. A storm can undo a year of labor in an afternoon. The mythic beginning is not just something that happened long ago. It is a condition always pressing against the present. In some traditions, the deep freshwater realm becomes especially associated with wisdom and craft, with the god Enki, known later as Ea. This connection is striking. The watery deep is not only danger, it is also intelligence, fertility, hidden knowledge, and the source from which solutions may come. Mesopotamian thought rarely flattens a divine force into one simple meaning. Water threatens and sustains. The deep conceals monsters, but also wisdom. The same element that can dissolve the city can make civilization possible. That complexity is one reason these myths still feel alive. They do not divide reality into neat categories of good nature and evil chaos. The ancient world was too practical for that. Farmers, sailors, priests, and rulers all knew that the forces that feed you may also destroy you. Dependence and fear were not opposites. They were neighbors. If we imagine an early Mesopotamian looking at the marshes of the south, at river channels shifting through reeds and mud, the idea becomes less abstract. Land could seem to appear out of water. Settlements rose from packed earth. Bricks were shaped from mud and dried into architecture. Writing itself began with clay, a material that belonged to wet ground before it became record, law, hymn, and myth. The civilization's memory was literally formed from the substance of riverland. This does not mean myth is simply geography turned into story. That would be too mechanical. But geography gave thought its textures. When Mesopotamian poets imagined the beginning, they reached for what surrounded them. Depth, mud, water, separation, building, naming. Their creation was not a clean burst of light. It was more like the making of habitable ground. There is something almost unsettling in that. The world was not guaranteed. It had to be made usable. It had to be held together. And human beings, when they eventually appear in these stories, do not enter a universe designed primarily for their comfort. They arrive late, into a cosmos already crowded with divine needs, divine tensions, and divine labor. Before humanity, there are gods. Before cities, there are forces. Before law, there is power. And before power takes recognizable form, there is water. The primeval waters are therefore more than a beginning. They are a warning. Every wall, every field, every throne, every tablet, every temple stands on an arrangement that might have been otherwise. Creation is not the end of danger. It is the first successful postponement of collapse. From these waters, the gods begin to take their places. The sky rises into authority. The earth becomes the stage of life and death. The deep keeps its secrets. And above this fragile architecture, a divine hierarchy starts to form. Distant, brilliant, severe, arranging the universe in a pattern that humans would spend their lives trying to understand. Chapter 4. Anu, Enlil, Enki, and the Architecture of Heaven. Once the world had been divided into recognizable regions, The gods themselves had to be understood in relation to one another. Mesopotamian mythology did not imagine divinity as a misty crowd of interchangeable spirits. It imagined rank, authority, territory, offices of cosmic power. The universe had structure, and that structure looked in many ways like the world human beings already knew. A world of courts, households, temples, officials, messengers, servants, and rulers whose decisions could alter many lives at once. At the height of this divine order stood Anu, the great sky god, whose name carried the weight of heaven itself. He was not always the most active figure in the stories that survive, and that can make him easy to underestimate. But distance was part of his meaning. Anu's power was not the power of constant motion. It was the authority of height, origin, and legitimacy. He represented the uppermost realm, the remote brilliance from which divine kingship could be imagined to descend. In human terms, he was less like a battlefield commander and more like the principle that made command possible. This is an important distinction. Modern readers often expect the highest god to dominate every story. Mesopotamian religion does not always work that way. A god could be supreme in rank and still distant in narrative presence. Authority did not need to speak in every scene to remain authority. In fact, the less approachable Anu appears, the more he resembles certain forms of power in the ancient world. Elevated, ceremonial, difficult to reach, and surrounded by layers of divine administration. Below that high sky authority, or perhaps operating more directly within the inhabited cosmos, was Enlil. If Anu was the height of heaven, Enlil was the force that pressed upon the world. He was associated with wind, command, kingship, and destiny, and in many traditions, he appears as one of the most decisive gods in the divine assembly. Enlil's power is not gentle. It moves through decree. It establishes order, but it can also bring catastrophe. When human noise, disorder, or excess becomes intolerable in certain myths, Enlil is often the god whose judgment turns dangerous. There is something severe about him, and that severity tells us a great deal about Mesopotamian ideas of order. Order was not imagined as kindness. It was imagined as control, hierarchy, and the proper arrangement of things. Enlil could grant kingship, uphold cosmic balance, and authorize civilization, but the same force that legitimized a throne could also sanction destruction. This is not contradiction in the Mesopotamian imagination. It is the terrifying double nature of command. The power that protects the city is also the power that can abandon it. Then there is Enki, known in Akkadian as Ea, one of the most fascinating figures in the entire mythic world. He is associated with the freshwater deep, wisdom, craft, magic, clever counsel, and the hidden intelligence beneath creation. If Enlil's authority often feels like a decree from above, Enki's power feels like a solution rising from below. He thinks around the edges. He advises. He shapes. He protects life, though not always by open rebellion. In several myths, he occupies the role of the divine strategist, the one who understands that survival sometimes depends on interpretation rather than force. This makes Enki unusually sympathetic to modern readers, though we should be careful not to turn him into a simple hero. He belongs fully to the divine order. He is not a revolutionary standing outside it. His wisdom often works within limits, through loopholes, warnings, designs, and carefully chosen speech. That may be precisely why he mattered so much. In a world where divine power could not simply be defeated, intelligence became a form of mercy. Enki shows that the cosmos was not only ruled by command, it could also be navigated by craft. Together, Anu, Enlil, and Enki form something like an architecture of power, sky authority, executive command, and deep wisdom. This is not a rigid system preserved identically in every period or city, and the details shift across the long history of Mesopotamian religion. Local traditions mattered. Political changes mattered. Sumerian names and Akkadian names overlapped, merged, and transformed. But as a broad pattern, this triad helps us understand how Mesopotamians imagined the universe as layered rather than flat. Heaven was not merely up there. The earth was not merely the ground beneath one's feet. The deep was not merely water. Each realm carried a kind of authority. The sky gave legitimacy. The air and storm enforced order. The subterranean waters held fertility and knowledge. Creation depended on the relationship among these zones. Too much command without wisdom becomes destruction. Wisdom without authority may remain hidden. Authority without enforcement becomes distant and ceremonial. The myths do not explain this in the language of philosophy, but they dramatize it again and again. It is tempting to compare this world to later pantheons, especially the Greek gods, with their quarrels and family intrigues. There are similarities, of course. Gods everywhere tend to reflect human power back to human beings in enlarged form. But the Mesopotamian divine hierarchy feels less like a royal household full of personalities and more like a cosmic state. The gods do have desires, grudges, favorites, and fears. Yet they also have offices. They hold powers called divine decrees. They make decisions in assembly. They assign destinies. Their world is political in the deepest sense. It is about who has the right to order reality. This is why kingship was never simply a human invention in Mesopotamian thought. Kingship descended from the gods. A king might build walls, lead armies, restore canals, and commission inscriptions praising his own greatness, as kings tend to do when no one is standing nearby with an editor. But his authority had to be framed as service to divine order. He was powerful because he was chosen, favored, appointed, or sustained by gods greater than himself. His palace mattered, but the temple mattered more profoundly, because the temple anchored the city in the cosmic hierarchy. The divine world also shaped law. Shamash, the sun god, would become especially associated with justice, but the broader idea of law depended on cosmic order. A just decision was not merely socially useful. It aligned human life with a structure believed to exceed human preference. To break order was not only to commit a crime, it was to disturb a pattern. That is why ritual, kingship, agriculture, warfare, and morality were so tightly woven together. The universe was not divided into neat modern categories. A failed ritual, a corrupt ruler, a broken oath, and a military disaster could all belong to the same frightening web of meaning. But here, too, we need caution. Mesopotamian texts often come from temples, scribal schools, royal courts, and elite settings. They preserve the voices of trained writers. Not every farmer, brewer, laborer, widow, or soldier who lived under these gods. We should not assume that everyone experienced theology in the same way. A scribe copying a hymn to Enlil, a king dedicating a temple, and a mother praying for a sick child all inhabited the same religious world, but not from the same position. The divine hierarchy could be majestic in literature and intensely personal in daily fear. That gap between cosmic order and human vulnerability gives these myths their lasting force. Anu may be too high to approach. Enlil may be too severe to trust completely. Enki may be wise, but even wisdom cannot erase mortality. The gods organize the world, but their order does not make human life easy. It gives life a place, a purpose, and a burden. And this burden leads directly to one of the most unsettling ideas in Mesopotamian myth. Human beings were not created as the beloved center of existence. They were made for work. Their lives were tied to divine need, temple service, sacrifice, and labor. Under the architecture of heaven, humanity would soon discover its assigned place, not on a throne, not among the stars, but in the fields, at the altars, and beneath the gaze of powers that had existed long before the first human breath. Chapter 5. The Making of Humanity. In Mesopotamian myth, human beings do not arrive as the shining purpose of creation. They arrive as a solution to a labor problem. That may sound almost brutally practical, but the practical imagination of Mesopotamia was never far from the sacred. Fields had to be worked. Canals had to be maintained. Food had to be prepared. Temples had to be supplied. The gods in these stories are not distant abstractions floating above need. They have households. They require service. They expect offerings. They live within a cosmic order that must be fed, maintained, and honored. Before humans exist, that work falls upon lesser gods, and eventually, in the myth known as Atrahasis, those gods grow tired. Their complaint is not poetic at first. It is exhaustion. They dig waterways. They carry baskets. They perform heavy labor until the burden becomes intolerable. Then comes unrest among the divine workers, a kind of supernatural strike against the order imposed from above. This is one of the details that makes the myth so revealing. Mesopotamian storytellers did not imagine creation beginning in perfect harmony. Even among the gods, labor creates tension. Rank creates resentment. The universe may have a hierarchy, but hierarchy does not remove fatigue. Enlil, the great authority, is disturbed by the rebellion. The problem must be solved, but not by abolishing work. Work is too necessary. Instead, the burden must be transferred. Enki, wise and inventive, helps shape the answer. A god is sacrificed, and from divine substance mixed with clay, humanity is formed. The image is unforgettable because it is both humble and terrifying. Clay belongs to the earth, to riverbanks, to the material of bricks and tablets. It is common, workable, close to the hand. But into that clay is mixed something divine, often connected with the blood or flesh of a slain god. Human beings are therefore not merely mud. They carry a trace of the divine world within them. But it is a trace born from violence, necessity, and compromise. This is not a sentimental origin. It says something severe about the human condition. We are made from earth, but not only earth. We are tied to the gods, but not equal to them. We are alive because a divine problem required a practical answer. Our bodies belong to labor. Our breath belongs to service. Our existence is useful before it is glorious. A modern listener may find this bleak, especially if expecting creation myths to tell us that humans are cherished above all other beings. Mesopotamian myth offers something more ambiguous. Humanity matters, but not because the cosmos was incomplete without human happiness. Humanity matters because the gods need workers, worshippers, and providers of offerings. The temple economy is projected backward into mythic time. The daily world of grain, livestock, ritual meals, and service becomes the reason humans exist at all. And yet there is more dignity here than it first appears. To serve the gods was not necessarily meaningless. In the Mesopotamian worldview, service connected human life to cosmic order. A farmer's harvest, a brewer's beer, a shepherd's flock, a scribe's tablet, a priest's ritual, a king's building project. All could be understood as part of maintaining the fragile arrangement between heaven, earth, and the deep. Labor was heavy, but it was not outside sacred history. Human work kept the world habitable. That is the contradiction at the heart of the myth. Humans are created as servants, but servants in a universe where service is the structure of survival. They are lowly, but necessary. Mortal, but touched by divinity. Replaceable in one sense, deeply dangerous in another, because once humans multiply, they become a new problem. Atrahasis does not stop at creation. It follows the consequences. Human beings increase in number. Their activity grows. Their noise rises. And the same gods who demanded relief from labor now become troubled by the very creatures made to relieve them. The complaint about human noise is easy to misread as a simple annoyance, as if Enlil were merely a sleepless neighbor with cosmic authority. But the word carries a wider anxiety. Human presence has become excessive. Too much life, too much sound, too much pressure against the order the gods intended. Here the myth becomes more than an origin story. It becomes a meditation on population, suffering, and divine control. The gods send afflictions to reduce humanity. Plague, famine, drought, and finally flood. The creation of humans does not lead into a peaceful age of abundance. It leads into cycles of correction. Life expands, power restrains it. Humanity becomes necessary and unbearable at the same time. This is one of the most unsettling insights in Mesopotamian mythology. The gods want humans, but not too many. They require offerings, but fear disruption. They create order, then punish the noise produced by that order. The human place in the cosmos is therefore uneasy from the beginning. We are not enemies of the gods, but we are not safe in their presence either. Mortality belongs to this arrangement. Human beings are not granted the permanence of the divine. Their lives are short, vulnerable, and dependent. Death is not treated as a moral punishment in the simple sense. It is part of the structure that keeps humanity within bounds. Immortality belongs elsewhere. The gods may be burdened by rivalry and fear, but they do not share the same limit that defines human life. To be human is to work, to worship, to suffer, to reproduce, to die, and to leave behind a name if fortune allows. This helps explain why later Mesopotamian stories return so obsessively to the problem of death. Gilgamesh will rage against it. Flood survivors will become exceptions to it. Laments over destroyed cities will measure the fragility of everything humans build before it. The origin of humanity already contains the end of humanity, because the clay that can be shaped can also crumble. Still, the myth does not reduce people to slaves in a crude way. The presence of divine material in humanity complicates the picture. There is a memory of godhood inside the mortal body, but it is not enough to rescue anyone from the grave. It gives human beings a strange status, made to serve, yet capable of speech, ritual, wisdom, rebellion, grief, and memory. They are low enough to be fashioned from clay, but significant enough that the gods must manage them carefully. Perhaps that is why the Mesopotamian account feels so honest in its severity. It does not flatter us. It does not place humanity comfortably at the center. Instead, it asks us to imagine a world where being human means living under obligations we did not choose, carrying a spark we cannot fully understand, and working within limits we cannot escape. There is a quiet tragedy in that, but also a kind of recognition. Most people in ancient Mesopotamia did not live as kings or high priests. They knew labor. They knew dependence. They knew that survival required service to powers greater than themselves: landlords, temples, rulers, seasons, rivers, gods. A myth in which humanity is made to bear burdens would not have sounded like an insult. It might have sounded like a cosmic explanation of ordinary life. The clay remembers the field. The divine blood remembers the heavens. Between them stands the human being, useful, restless, fragile, and loud enough to disturb the gods. And once that noise rises too high, the myths turn toward catastrophe. The same divine order that made humanity will decide that humanity must be reduced. The rivers that once made civilization possible will become instruments of undoing. And from the waters of destruction will emerge one of the oldest flood stories ever written. Chapter 6. The Great Flood before Noah. Long before the story of Noah became one of the most familiar flood narratives in the world, Mesopotamian scribes were already copying older tales of a chosen survivor, a sealed vessel, divine warning, catastrophic waters, and life beginning again under a changed sky. That does not mean the stories are identical. It also does not mean we can draw a simple straight line from one tablet to one later text and call the mystery solved. The ancient Near East was a world of shared motifs, migrating stories, scribal adaptation, and religious reinterpretation. Flood traditions moved through time the way floodwaters move through low land, not in one clean channel, but in branching currents. In the Mesopotamian version preserved in Atrahasis, the flood begins not with human wickedness in the later moral sense, but with disturbance. Humanity has multiplied. Human noise rises. The gods, especially Enlil, can no longer tolerate it. The problem is not framed as sin alone. It is pressure, excess, a world too crowded, too loud, too alive for the divine order that created it. This is what makes the myth so unnerving. Human beings were made to relieve the gods of labor, but their success becomes intolerable. They work, reproduce, build, and fill the world with sound. The very solution becomes the new crisis. The gods answer first with smaller disasters: plague, famine, drought. Each attempt reduces the human population, but not permanently. Life returns, noise returns, the pressure builds again. Finally, the decision is made. A flood will wipe humanity away. The story could have ended there, in total erasure. But Mesopotamian mythology often leaves room for wisdom to move quietly against destruction. Enki, bound in some way by divine counsel, yet unwilling to let humanity vanish, finds a way to warn Atrahasis. In some tellings, he does not speak to the man directly, but addresses a wall, allowing the warning to pass through a kind of sacred technicality. It is a wonderfully Mesopotamian detail. Survival depends not on open rebellion, but on a loophole. Atrahasis receives the message. He is told to dismantle his house and build a boat. The command is strange because it asks him to trade stability for survival. A house belongs to settled life, to family, land, inheritance, city. A boat belongs to uncertainty. To live, he must take apart the symbol of rooted existence and turn it into something that can drift. That transformation is at the heart of the flood myth. The world of boundaries is about to dissolve. Field, street, canal, palace, temple, courtyard, all will be swallowed into one surface of water. The boat becomes a temporary cosmos, a small ordered space floating above the collapse of order itself. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood survivor is known as Utnapishtim. Gilgamesh finds him not because he is interested in flood history, but because he is terrified of death. Utnapishtim has received something no ordinary human can claim: a form of immortal existence after surviving the flood. So his story becomes more than a memory of catastrophe. It becomes evidence of an exception. Somewhere, Gilgamesh thinks, there may be a crack in the law of mortality. Utnapishtim recounts the divine decision, the warning, the construction of the boat, the terrifying storm, and the stillness after destruction. The gods themselves are not shown as calm masters of the disaster they unleash. Some accounts describe them as frightened by the scale of what happens. This detail changes the mood of the myth. The flood is not a clean instrument controlled with perfect detachment. It is a catastrophe that overwhelms even divine confidence. That is one of the oldest and strangest insights in these stories. Power does not always imply wisdom. The gods can authorize destruction and still recoil from it. They can rule the cosmos and still misjudge the consequences of their own decisions. Mesopotamian myth does not give us gods who are morally tidy. It gives us gods whose authority is real, but whose actions can be troubling, excessive, and divided among themselves. When the waters subside, the survivor sends out birds. Life must be tested before land can be trusted. The boat comes to rest. An offering is made. The smell of sacrifice draws the gods, and here the myth returns to a practical truth hidden inside its terror. The gods need humans. Without human beings, there are no offerings, no temple service, no smoke rising from the altar. The flood solves one problem by nearly creating another. So humanity is not destroyed completely. Instead, limits are introduced. Mortality, infertility, infant mortality, priestly roles, and other restraints appear in some traditions as ways of keeping human numbers within bounds. The flood does not end the uneasy relationship between gods and humans. It revises it. The world after the flood is not innocent. It is managed. This is where the comparison with the later story of Noah becomes unavoidable, but it should be handled carefully. The Mesopotamian flood traditions are older in written form than the biblical version, and they share striking elements: divine decision, chosen survivor, ark or boat, animals, destructive waters, birds sent out, sacrifice after landing. But the meanings are not the same. In the biblical story, the flood is tied more strongly to moral corruption and covenant. In Atrahasis, the concern is closer to population, noise, labor, and the management of creation. Similar architecture, different theology. That difference matters. It reminds us that myths do not travel as fossils. They are reinterpreted by the communities that preserve them. A story about divine irritation and cosmic overcrowding can become, in another tradition, a story about righteousness, judgment, and promise. The bones may resemble each other, but the heart has changed. For Mesopotamia, the flood is not simply punishment. It is a memory of vulnerability written at cosmic scale. Anyone living between unpredictable rivers would understand the terror of water crossing its boundary. A real flood destroys by making the familiar unreadable. Roads disappear, fields vanish, houses become islands, then wreckage. The myth enlarges that experience until the entire human world becomes a drowned plain. And yet, after the waters, there is a tablet, a story, a survivor speaking to a king who wants to escape death. That frame is crucial. In Gilgamesh, the flood tale is not told merely to explain the past. It teaches Gilgamesh that immortality is not a prize that effort can simply seize. Utnapishtim survived because of a unique divine decision, not because he discovered a method available to everyone. The flood story becomes a boundary marker. It shows that exceptions exist, but also that exceptions do not abolish the rule. For ordinary human beings, the lesson is harsher. The gods may preserve life, but they do not promise safety. They may regret destruction, but regret does not restore the drowned. They may need humanity, but need is not love in any simple sense. The flood before Noah, then, is not only an ancient prototype. It is a Mesopotamian confession of how fragile creation felt. The world had been ordered from water, and water could return to claim it. Humanity had been made from clay, and clay could dissolve. Civilization rose by controlling rivers, but the deepest myths remembered that control was temporary. The survivor steps out into a world washed clean and permanently altered. Behind him lies the drowned noise of humanity. Before him lies a future where life continues under stricter limits. The gods have learned something, perhaps. Humanity has learned something too. But the bargain remains uneasy. The waters recede, and the old fear does not. Chapter 7. Inanna and the Dangerous Power of Desire. Among the gods of Mesopotamia, few are as difficult to hold still as Inanna. She is love, but not softness. She is war, but not only violence. She is sexual desire, political ambition, royal power, beauty, danger, and the strange hunger that makes human beings reach beyond the limits assigned to them. Later known widely as Ishtar, she moves through Mesopotamian myth with a force that can feel almost modern in its contradictions. She is adored, feared, invoked, blamed, celebrated, and never safely reduced to one role. That is what makes her so compelling. Many gods represent a domain. Inanna feels like a pressure. She belongs to the places where life becomes unstable. The battlefield, the bedroom, the throne room, the city gate. The moment of choice when wanting something begins to change the world around it. To call her a goddess of love is true, but incomplete. Mesopotamian love was not always imagined as gentle companionship. Desire could join people, ruin judgment, produce heirs, provoke rivalry, and overturn households. It could be sacred, pleasurable, strategic, and dangerous at once. The same is true of war. Inanna's violence is not merely brute force. It is intensity, conquest, the thrill of power breaking through restraint. She does not fit neatly into the image of a motherly fertility goddess, and that matters. She unsettles the assumption that ancient goddesses were always nurturing figures tied quietly to domestic life. Inanna is far more disruptive. She desires. She demands. She crosses boundaries that other beings hesitate to cross. In one famous Sumerian tradition, she seeks the me, the divine powers or decrees associated with civilization, kingship, wisdom, music, craft, sexuality, warfare, priesthood, and many other elements that structure culture. The details are layered and sometimes difficult, but the story's emotional shape is clear. Inanna goes to Enki, receives or takes these powers, and brings them to her city, Uruk. Enki later regrets what has happened and tries to recover them, but Inanna succeeds in carrying them away. It is tempting to read this simply as a clever theft, but the story is richer than that. Inanna is not stealing trinkets. She is acquiring the operating codes of civilization. The myth imagines culture itself as transferable, contested, and politically charged. Divine power is not just something possessed. It can move. A city's greatness depends on what powers it holds, what gods favor it, and what stories explain that favor. Inanna, then, becomes a mythic force behind urban ambition. She is not content to remain decorative. She wants the instruments that make a city powerful. In that sense, she embodies a truth Mesopotamian culture knew well. Civilization is not innocent. It is built from music and law, yes, but also from hierarchy, sexuality, weapons, persuasion, and control. The same divine powers that make refinement possible also make domination possible. This is why Inanna's contradictions are not flaws in the mythology. They are the point. Love and war are not opposites when both are understood as forces that seize the body, disturb reason, and remake loyalties. Desire can be as commanding as a king. Battle can be as intoxicating as passion. A city can desire power the way a lover desires a beloved, with devotion, hunger, jealousy, and poor long-term planning. There is a dry lesson in that, though ancient kings rarely enjoyed having their ambitions described as poor planning. Inanna's myths often show her testing boundaries. She does not politely accept the arrangement of the world simply because it is ancient. In some stories, this makes her creative and civilizing. In others, reckless. The difference depends on where one stands. To Uruk, her acquisition of divine powers may look like glory. To Enki, it may look like disorder. To later readers, it looks like a myth about the dangerous movement of authority from one center to another. Her relationship with kingship is equally complex. Inanna could legitimize rulers. Royal hymns and traditions link her favor with political authority, especially in the world of Uruk. But divine favor was never a harmless ornament. To be loved by Inanna could mean being raised high, exposed, and tested. Her affection was power, and power in Mesopotamian myth almost always came with risk. This is especially clear when we approach the figure of Dumuzi, the shepherd associated with her in myth and cult. Their relationship is charged with fertility, sexuality, and royal symbolism, but it is not a simple romance. Inanna's desire has cosmic consequences. Love here is entangled with seasonal rhythms, social order, and death. The beloved can become victim. The chosen one can become substitute. The bedchamber and the underworld are closer than they first appear. That closeness may be one reason Inanna feels so unsettling. She brings life into motion, but motion does not guarantee safety. Desire begins stories that no one can completely control. A longing for power may found a city's greatness. A longing for love may lead to grief. A longing to cross forbidden thresholds may bring knowledge, humiliation, or death. And Inanna crosses thresholds. She is not the kind of deity who remains in one sacred role. She moves between worlds, between identities, between forms of power that later cultures often tried to separate. She exposes how artificial those separations can be. Politics is never free of desire. War is never free of performance. Sexuality is never merely private when dynasties, inheritance, and divine favor are involved. Beauty is not weakness when it can command attention and alter fate. At the same time, we should be careful not to turn Inanna into a modern symbol too easily. She was not a slogan waiting thousands of years for us to discover her. She belonged to ancient cities, rituals, hymns, and theological systems very different from our own. Her power does not map perfectly onto modern categories of gender, freedom, or identity. But that is precisely why she is valuable. She resists being made comfortable. What we can say with more confidence is that Mesopotamian tradition allowed a female deity to occupy a startling range of authority: erotic, military, royal, cosmic, and destructive. She could inspire devotion without becoming tame. She could be praised without being simplified. The culture that imagined her did not need divine femininity to be safe in order for it to be sacred. Inanna's danger lies not only in what she does, but in what she reveals. She shows that the forces most central to human life are also the least controllable: love, ambition, violence, fertility, status, beauty, victory. These do not stay inside neat boundaries. They overflow. They demand stories because rules alone cannot contain them. And that brings us to one of the most haunting stories preserved about her. The goddess who gathers power, who commands desire, who stands radiant in the city, decides to descend into the realm where none of those powers can protect her. The journey is not a conquest in the ordinary sense. It is a stripping away. Gate by gate, title by title, ornament by ornament, Inanna enters the place where desire meets its limit. And even a great goddess learns what cannot be carried into death. Chapter 8. The Descent into the Underworld. Inanna's most famous journey begins with an impossible decision. The radiant goddess of love, war, and royal power turns her attention downward. Not toward another city, not toward another lover, not toward another throne. Downward, into the realm of her sister Ereshkigal, the queen of the dead. The story is haunting because it does not treat the underworld as an adventure landscape. It is not a place waiting to be conquered by courage. It is a legal and cosmic territory, governed by rules older than ambition. Inanna may be powerful in the world above, but the land below is not hers. To enter it is to pass into a system where beauty, authority, sexuality, and violence lose their familiar force. Before descending, Inanna prepares carefully. She dresses in the symbols of her power: crown, beads, breastplate, measuring rod, line, and royal garments. These are not mere accessories. They are the visible grammar of status. She enters the story clothed in identity, carrying the signs that declare who she is and what she can command. But she also gives instructions. If she does not return, help must be sought. That detail matters. Inanna is bold, but not foolish in a simple way. She understands that this journey may not obey the rules she is used to. Her confidence has a shadow of calculation. She makes arrangements before crossing the threshold, as though some part of her already knows that descent is not the same as victory. At the gates of the underworld, she is stopped. This is where the myth slows down into ritual terror. The underworld has gates, and each gate demands the removal of something she wears. Piece by piece, Inanna is stripped of her ornaments and offices. At the first gate, one emblem is taken, then another, then another. The process is repetitive, but not dull. It feels ceremonial, almost bureaucratic, which somehow makes it more frightening. There is no battle, no thunderous resistance. There is procedure. Power is removed by protocol. By the time Inanna stands before Ereshkigal, she is naked and bowed low. The goddess who entered crowned and adorned arrives emptied of the signs that made her recognizable. This is one of the myth's most devastating insights. Death does not defeat power by arguing with it. Death defeats power by making its symbols irrelevant. The crown cannot command there. The jewels cannot persuade. The body itself, exposed and unprotected, becomes the final truth. Ereshkigal, often overshadowed in popular retellings by her more dazzling sister, is not simply a villain. She is the sovereign of a realm no one wants to visit, and no one can finally avoid. Her power is grim because her office is grim. She rules the dead, not because the myth needs a monster, but because death itself must have government. Even the land of no return has order. Inanna is judged, struck down, and turned into a corpse. The image is severe, but the myth does not linger in gore. Its terror is colder than that. A great goddess hangs lifeless, and the world above begins to feel the absence. Desire, fertility, and generative power are interrupted. The descent of Inanna is not only personal danger, it is cosmic disturbance. When a power as central as hers is removed, reality does not simply continue as before. Help comes through Enki, whose wisdom often works where direct force would fail. He creates small beings, humble and strange, who are able to enter the underworld without threatening it. They do not storm Ereshkigal's realm. They do something subtler. They sympathize with her suffering. This is one of the most unexpected turns in the myth. Ereshkigal is found in pain, and the rescuers do not overpower her. They echo her cries. They acknowledge her anguish. In return, she offers a gift, and they ask for Inanna's body. Life is restored through empathy, ritual intelligence, and careful speech, not through conquest. Yet rescue does not erase law. Inanna can leave the underworld only if someone takes her place. This is the hard balance at the center of the story. The realm below cannot simply be cheated. A life restored above must be answered by a life given below. The underworld may be entered, and one may even return, but return has a price. When Inanna comes back, she is accompanied by demonic beings who seek a substitute. They first encounter figures who have mourned her, and she refuses to surrender them. Mourning protects them, in a sense. Their grief proves loyalty. Then she finds Dumuzi, associated with her as lover or consort, seated in splendor rather than marked by mourning. The moment is morally difficult, and that difficulty should not be flattened. Some versions and related traditions complicate Dumuzi's role, his guilt, and his fate. But in the emotional logic of the descent, His failure to grieve matters. Inanna has passed through death and returned stripped, judged, and altered. Dumuzi appears untouched, still enthroned in the world of the living. To her, this is not neutrality. It is betrayal. He becomes the substitute. Here the myth turns from cosmic drama to intimate unease. The person closest to the goddess becomes the one drawn toward the underworld in her place. Desire and death, which had already been walking near each other, now meet openly. Love does not save Dumuzi from the law of exchange. In some traditions, his sister Inanna shares his fate for part of the year, introducing a rhythm of absence and return. The myth touches seasonal patterns, mourning rites, and the painful human knowledge that love often survives by dividing grief. What makes the descent so powerful is that it refuses an easy lesson. It is not simply a warning against ambition, though ambition is present. It is not simply a fertility myth, though fertility is deeply involved. It is not simply a story of death and resurrection, though those words hover nearby. It is a myth about limits. Inanna can cross boundaries, but she cannot abolish them. She can descend, but she cannot carry her full authority into every realm. She can return, but not freely. Even a goddess must submit to the laws of a place where her usual powers do not apply. That may be why the gates matter so much. They show identity being taken apart layer by layer. What are we when title, beauty, rank, weapon, desire, and ornament are removed? Mesopotamian myth does not answer gently. It says that beneath the signs of power is vulnerability. Beneath vulnerability is law. Beneath law is the underworld, waiting without hatred and without mercy. Inanna rises again, but not unchanged. The world above receives her back, yet the cost of return continues below. Dumuzi's fate remains tied to hers. Ereshkigal's realm remains intact. The dead are not liberated. The boundary is not destroyed. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part. The myth allows passage but not escape. It imagines restoration, but not victory over death. Inanna, who commands love and war, discovers that there is a kingdom where command itself must kneel. The descent does not make her smaller. It makes the universe larger, darker, and more exacting than power alone can master. Chapter 9. Ereshkigal, Nergal, and the Land of No Return. If Inanna's descent shows the underworld from the viewpoint of a visitor, Mesopotamian death looks very different when we remain there. The realm below was not imagined as a courtroom where souls were sorted into reward and punishment according to moral worth. It was not paradise for the righteous and fire for the wicked. It was a dim continuation, a reduced existence, a place where the dead endured rather than triumphed. To modern ears, that can sound almost brutally bleak, but it also reveals something important. Mesopotamian afterlife thought was less concerned with final justice than with continuity, obligation, and fear of neglect. The dead did not vanish. That was the problem. They became ghosts, presences, dependent beings who still had claims on the living. A properly buried person, remembered and given offerings, might remain quiet. A neglected dead person could become restless. The boundary between household and grave was not sealed by sentiment. It had to be maintained through ritual care. Food, drink, names, offerings, and funerary attention were not decorative gestures. They were part of a relationship that continued after breath had stopped. This makes Mesopotamian death deeply domestic. The underworld was cosmic, yes, but anxiety about it often entered through the family. Did the dead have descendants to remember them? Would offerings be made? Would the body be treated properly? Would a ghost return because something had gone wrong? The fear was not only that one might die. Everyone died. The fear was that death might be mishandled. Ereshkigal ruled this realm with a severity that suited it. She was queen of the great below, not because the dead needed comfort, but because they needed order. Her authority feels heavy, almost airless. In myths, she is not simply a shadow version of Inanna. She is a sovereign in her own right, bound to a kingdom that no one celebrates entering. Her court has judges, attendants, gatekeepers, and rules. Even misery has administration. That is one of the most distinctive features of Mesopotamian imagination. The underworld is grim, but not lawless. It is not chaos. It is a state beneath the state, a palace beneath the palace, a city of the dead mirroring the structures of the living in darker form. The same civilization that organized irrigation, temple service, scribal records, and royal authority imagined death as organized too. The dead did not become free. They entered another jurisdiction. The phrase often associated with this realm, the land of no return, should be heard carefully. It does not mean that every myth absolutely forbids temporary passage. Inanna's story itself complicates that. It means that for ordinary beings, death is a one-way transfer. The human road ends there. Kings, servants, warriors, children, priests, laborers, all pass into the same diminished country. Status may echo, but it does not rescue. The throne does not become immortality. The body's fall cancels every earthly performance. Nergal adds another layer to this world. Often associated with war, plague, and destructive heat, he is a god whose presence already carries death into the upper world. His connection with Ereshkigal, preserved in later mythic traditions, brings together violence above and sovereignty below. In one story, Nergal offends the etiquette of the underworld's queen, descends to her realm, confronts her, and eventually becomes her consort. The details vary, and the tale has the strange texture of divine politics mixed with danger, desire, and negotiated power. What matters is not simply that Ereshkigal gets a husband, as though the myth were a gloomy marriage arrangement. The deeper point is that death's kingdom becomes linked with forces that kill before their time. War, epidemic, scorching devastation. Nergal is not only a ruler after death. He is a reminder that death also arrives through the world's violence. The underworld is not separate from history. It receives what battlefields, fevers, famine, and disaster send down. This is where Mesopotamian afterlife belief becomes emotionally sharp. If death were only a distant destiny, people might place it at the edge of thought. But ghosts, omens, illness, and improper burials made death feel close. A person could be troubled by the dead. A household could fear an angry spirit. Ritual specialists might be called to diagnose and address disturbances believed to come from ghosts or demons. Whether we read these practices as religion, psychology, medicine, or social repair, they show a culture trying to give form to invisible pressure. There is caution needed here. We should not pretend that every Mesopotamian text gives us a single uniform doctrine of the afterlife. Beliefs shifted across centuries, regions, languages, and social settings. The evidence is uneven. Some texts are mythological, some ritual, some literary, some administrative, some scholarly. They do not combine into one tidy handbook. But the recurring emotional pattern is clear enough. Death was not imagined as moral release. It was dependency, dimness, and risk. The dead needed the living. The living feared the dead. Each side remained entangled. That entanglement may explain why memory mattered so much. To have one's name preserved was not merely vanity. A name linked a person to ongoing existence in the human world. Kings carved inscriptions partly to proclaim power, but also to resist erasure. Families remembered ancestors not only out of affection, but because forgetting could be dangerous. Writing, burial, offering, and ritual all became small defenses against disappearance. Still, no defense was complete. The Mesopotamian underworld did not offer much consolation. It offered recognition. It admitted what many cultures prefer to soften: that death reduces, separates, and makes the once powerful dependent. It does not promise that suffering will be balanced by reward. It does not promise that kings will be judged into humility or the poor exalted into glory. It gives a darker answer. The dead continue, but less brightly. Their world is ordered, but joyless. Their fate is shared, but lonely. And yet, strangely, this bleakness can feel honest. The people who imagined Ereshkigal's kingdom lived in a world where cities fell. Children died young. Disease moved without explanation. And war could turn living neighborhoods into places of mourning. A comforting afterlife might have been possible to imagine, but Mesopotamian tradition often chose something sterner: death as a fact requiring care, ritual, and humility. The land of no return stands behind everything else in these myths. It waits beneath desire, kingship, labor, war, and wisdom. It waits beneath the triumphs of cities and the prayers of households. Even the gods must respect its laws when they cross its gates. That is why the underworld is not merely a dark episode in Mesopotamian mythology. It is the pressure that gives the rest of the stories their urgency. If life is brief, offerings matter. If ghosts linger, memory matters. If death is unavoidable, kingship becomes fragile. Love becomes dangerous. And the search for immortality becomes both understandable and doomed. Above ground, the cities continue to build their walls and raise their temples. Below, Ereshkigal's kingdom receives everyone in time. And between those two worlds, the living keep watch, feeding the gods, naming the dead, and hoping that the boundary holds. Chapter 10. Monsters at the edge of order. Every civilization draws a line around itself. Inside the line are walls, fields, laws, families, markets, temples, and names written carefully into clay. Outside it are the places where the map becomes less obedient. Mountains, deserts, marshes, foreign roads, disease, night travel, fever, childbirth, war, and the uneasy spaces where human control thins out. Mesopotamian monsters lived along that line. They were not merely creatures invented to frighten children, though they were certainly frightening enough for the job. They gave shape to forces that people could not safely ignore. The wilderness had a face. Illness had claws. Divine punishment could take form. The unknown beyond the city wall could be imagined, named, ritualized, and sometimes defended against. A monster in this world was not just an enemy. It was a warning that order had an edge. One of the most famous of these beings is Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest in the Epic of Gilgamesh. He is often remembered as a monstrous opponent, defeated by Gilgamesh and Enkidu, but reducing him to a simple villain misses the deeper tension of the story. Humbaba guards a sacred and distant forest, a place associated with divine authority and natural grandeur. He is terrifying, yes, but he is not merely random chaos. He protects a boundary. That makes Gilgamesh's expedition more morally complicated than a heroic monster hunt. The king and his companion leave the city and go outward, toward fame, timber, and danger. They seek a deed that will outlive them. Humbaba stands between human ambition and the forbidden wealth of the wild. When he falls, the victory is glorious on the surface, but the glory is not clean. A guardian has been killed. A protected place has been violated. The story does not need to lecture us for the unease to be felt. The Bull of Heaven carries a different kind of terror. Sent against Gilgamesh after he rejects Ishtar, the bull is not a beast from ordinary wilderness, but a weapon of divine outrage. It brings drought, destruction, and panic. Here the monster embodies punishment descending from the gods into civic life. The city is no longer protected by its walls, because the threat has divine permission to enter. This is a crucial difference. Some monsters lurk beyond order. Others arrive because order has been disturbed from above. In Mesopotamian thought, danger did not always come from outside civilization. Sometimes it came through the very powers that civilization served. A god offended, a ritual neglected, a king overreaching, a boundary crossed too boldly. Any of these could open the way for catastrophe. Then there are figures like Lamashtu, one of the most feared demonic beings in Mesopotamian tradition. She was associated especially with threats to infants, mothers, pregnancy, and the fragile passage into life. Her terror was intimate. She did not wait in distant forests. She entered the house, the bedroom, the nursery, the vulnerable hours when survival depended on forces no family could fully command. The fear surrounding Lamashtu tells us something important about ancient life. Childbirth and infancy were dangerous, and societies had to make emotional and ritual sense of that danger. To name a demon was not simply superstition in the shallow sense. It was a way to confront a pattern of suffering that could otherwise feel unbearable. Amulets, incantations, protective figures, and ritual specialists formed a defensive language against invisible harm. Pazuzu, strangely, complicates the picture further. Modern popular culture often treats him as a figure of pure evil, largely because later imagination has torn him from his original setting and given him a new career in horror. In Mesopotamian tradition, he is more ambiguous. He is a frightening wind demon, associated with destructive forces, but images of him could be used protectively, especially against Lamashtu. One danger could be invoked against another. That may seem paradoxical, but it is very Mesopotamian. The world was not divided into neat shelves labeled good and evil. Power was dangerous by nature. A force that could harm might also defend if properly named, shaped, and directed. The terrifying face of Pazuzu could become a shield. Fear could be turned outward, posted at the threshold like a guard no one would invite to dinner, but no one wanted to dismiss too quickly either. This logic appears again and again in protective magic. Hybrid beings, fierce spirits, lion-headed figures, fish-cloaked sages, and other strange forms could stand at doors, beds, palaces, and temples as guardians. Their ugliness or strangeness was not a failure of beauty. It was functional. They were meant to frighten what frightened human beings. Monsters also revealed the limits of kingship. A king could build walls, command soldiers, commission inscriptions, and claim the favor of great gods. But fever could still enter. A nightmare could still trouble the mind. A child could still weaken in the night. A storm could still ruin the fields. Mesopotamian demonology is, in part, the underside of royal confidence. It remembers what official monuments prefer to minimize. Life remained vulnerable. Even the grand chaos creatures of creation myth belong to this pattern. Tiamat, in the Babylonian creation epic, is not just a dragon-like enemy waiting to be slain. She represents primeval power, the older waters, the terrifying maternal depth from which the gods themselves emerge and against which cosmic order is later established. Her defeat by Marduk will become central to Babylonian political theology. But the symbolism is not merely decorative. The world is organized through conflict with something ancient and immense. Yet again, the monster is not meaningless evil. Tiamat is source and threat, mother and enemy, origin and obstacle. Mesopotamian myth often places its deepest anxieties in beings who are double-sided. The force that precedes order must be overcome for order to exist, but it can never be dismissed as unreal. The city stands because chaos has been pushed back, not because chaos has ceased to be. This is why monsters mattered. They marked pressure points in the system. Humbaba at the forest, the bull of heaven in divine anger, Lamashtu at the edge of birth, Pazuzu in the dangerous wind, Tiamat at the beginning of cosmic order. Each one appears where human life meets a force it cannot fully master. There is also a psychological honesty in these figures. Mesopotamians lived in a world dense with risks, but they did not leave those risks shapeless. They gave them names, genealogies, images, rituals, and stories. That act did not make danger disappear, but it made danger addressable. A named terror can be watched. A pictured demon can be repelled. A mythic guardian can be understood as guarding something, not merely snarling in the dark. Of course, we should not imagine that every monster had one fixed meaning in every century. Texts changed. Local traditions varied. Some beings appear in rituals, others in epics, others in scholarly lists or protective objects. A creature that terrifies in one context may defend in another. The evidence often reaches us unevenly, broken across tablets and later copies, but the larger pattern remains. Mesopotamian monsters were part of the grammar of order. They stood where the world frayed. And in that sense, they are not so distant from us. We still turn invisible threats into images. We still give names to diseases, disasters, fears, and forces beyond control. We still tell stories about the wilderness beyond our systems, even when our systems are made of satellites and screens rather than mud brick walls. The monsters have changed costumes, but the boundary remains. For Gilgamesh, that boundary will become personal. He can fight Humbaba. He can face the bull of heaven. He can return to Uruk with fame carved into memory, but no weapon, no royal title, and no heroic victory can defeat the monster that waits inside every human life. After the battles, after the glory, after the songs of strength, Gilgamesh will meet the terror that cannot be killed in combat, the certainty that even kings must die. Chapter 11. Gilgamesh and the Terror of Mortality. Gilgamesh enters Mesopotamian mythology not as a saint, and not even as a comfortable hero. He is a king too large for his city. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, he rules Uruk with a force that has become unbearable. The walls of the city are magnificent. The king is mighty. His name is surrounded by divine ancestry and royal prestige, but power has swollen into abuse. The people cry out, and the gods answer not by removing Gilgamesh, but by creating someone strong enough to meet him. That someone is Enkidu. At first, Enkidu belongs to the wild. He lives beyond the city, among animals, outside the polished systems of kingship, labor, and law. He is not lesser than Gilgamesh. He is his counterweight. The story does not begin by saying that civilization is pure good and wilderness pure chaos. It begins by placing two forms of strength on a collision course: the king inside the walls and the untamed man beyond them. Enkidu is drawn into human society through intimacy, food, drink, clothing, and speech. This is sometimes described too simply as civilization conquering nature. But the myth is more delicate than that. Enkidu gains human knowledge, but loses his old belonging among the animals. He becomes more like us and therefore more divided. To enter culture is to receive bread, beer, friendship, and fame, but also shame, separation, and eventually the knowledge of death. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu finally meet, their first encounter is violent. They wrestle. The city watches. Strength tests strength. But the fight does not end with one man destroyed. It ends with recognition. Each has found the only being capable of answering him. Friendship, in this story, is not decorative. It is the force that changes kingship. Enkidu does not simply accompany Gilgamesh. He humanizes him. The restless king who once consumed his city now turns outward, seeking fame through dangerous deeds. Together they journey to the cedar forest to confront Humbaba. They kill the guardian. They return with glory. Later, they face the bull of heaven, sent after Gilgamesh rejects Ishtar. Again, they triumph. On the surface, these are heroic victories, monsters defeated, courage proven, names made larger. But Mesopotamian myth is rarely impressed by victory alone. The deaths of Humbaba and the bull of heaven disturb the divine order. Someone must pay. The gods decide that Enkidu will die. Not Gilgamesh, though he is the king. Not both of them, though they acted together. Enkidu. The choice feels unbearable because it is not explained in the moral language a modern viewer might expect. Enkidu does not die because the story wants a neat punishment that satisfies our sense of fairness. He dies because the world of the gods is hierarchical, dangerous, and not fully accountable to human grief. The decision comes from above, and the human heart is left to absorb it. Enkidu's death is the turning point of the epic. Until then, Gilgamesh has known danger as something to be challenged. A monster can be fought. A forest can be entered. A divine bull can be slain. But death is different. Death does not stand before him with a weapon. It takes his friend slowly, in illness, in weakness, in the collapse of the body that had once matched his own. Gilgamesh watches, and something breaks. His grief is physical, almost animal. He mourns Enkidu with a desperation that strips away royal performance. The king who once seemed too powerful for ordinary limits now discovers the most ordinary limit of all. The body fails. The beloved does not answer. Strength does not matter. Fame does not hold the dead in place. And then the fear sharpens. If Enkidu can die, so can Gilgamesh. This is the emotional center of the epic. It is not only a story about friendship. It is a story about the moment another person's death becomes a mirror. Gilgamesh sees his future in Enkidu's corpse. Mortality is no longer a doctrine, no longer a background truth, no longer something that happens to other people in laments and inscriptions. It has entered the room, so he runs. He leaves Uruk behind and searches for Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who received immortality. The journey is strange, lonely, and increasingly stripped of heroic confidence. Gilgamesh crosses terrifying distances. He passes through regions at the edge of human experience. He is warned, advised, delayed, and tested. Along the way, voices tell him something close to wisdom. Human beings cannot possess the life of the gods. Eat, drink, care for the living, accept the portion given to mortals. It is good advice. Gilgamesh cannot accept it. That refusal is what makes him human. Wisdom often arrives before we are ready for it. Grief does not become obedient simply because someone speaks truth nearby. Gilgamesh does not need a proverb. He needs Enkidu back, or failing that, some proof that death can be escaped. When he finally reaches Utnapishtim, the answer is devastating. Immortality was not earned by a technique Gilgamesh can repeat. It was granted as an exception after the flood. Utnapishtim's story does not open a door. It closes one. Gilgamesh has crossed the world to learn that the path he seeks does not belong to him. Even then, a last possibility appears, a plant that can restore youth. It is not immortality exactly, but it is something, a delay, a renewal, a little rebellion against decay. Gilgamesh obtains it and imagines bringing it back to Uruk, perhaps sharing it, perhaps using it to soften the human condition. Then, while he bathes, a serpent takes the plant. There is no grand duel, no speech from the heavens, no final heroic test. Just loss. Quick and almost humiliating. The king who defeated monsters loses his last hope to a creature slipping away through the grass. It is one of the most quietly painful moments in ancient literature because it feels so close to real life. Not every defeat arrives with thunder. Sometimes the thing you guarded badly is gone before you understand its value. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk, and here the epic performs its final turn. He does not return immortal. He does not return victorious in the way he wanted. He returns to the city, to its walls, to the work of human hands. The walls of Uruk cannot save him from death, but they can outlast a life. They can hold memory. They can testify that a mortal being, knowing he must die, still built something. This is not a cheap consolation. The epic does not pretend architecture equals immortality. Names fade, cities fall, tablets break. Even Uruk becomes ruin. But the story suggests that human meaning is not found in escaping mortality. It is found in what mortality makes urgent: friendship, grief, wisdom, building, remembering, and learning the size of one's own portion. Gilgamesh begins as a king who takes too much from his people. He ends as a man who has lost what he loved and discovered that no amount of strength can tear eternal life from the gods. The terror of mortality does not make him weak, it makes him recognizable. That is why his story still reaches us. Not because we believe we can find Utnapishtim beyond the waters. Not because we expect a plant of youth hidden at the bottom of the deep, but because every human life eventually stands where Gilgamesh stood, facing the fact that love makes death more terrible, and death makes love more precious. The king returns to his walls. The friend remains gone. The lesson remains unfinished, as the hardest lessons usually do. Chapter 12. Marduk and the Rise of Babylon. By the time Marduk stands at the center of Babylonian creation myth, we are no longer dealing only with the birth of the universe. We are watching theology become politics. That does not make the story fake or cynical or merely propaganda in the shallow sense. Ancient people did not separate divine truth from civic power the way a modern reader might want them to. A city's god, a king's legitimacy, a temple's prestige, and the structure of the cosmos could all belong to the same argument. In Babylon, that argument became astonishingly ambitious. The local god of one city was elevated into the organizer of reality itself. The great Babylonian creation epic, often called Enuma Elish from its opening words, begins before the ordered world has taken shape. Once again, we find the ancient waters. Apsu, associated with fresh water, and Tiamat, associated with the salt sea, mingle before the younger gods emerge. At first, creation is genealogy. The gods are born into a universe not yet stable, not yet properly arranged, and certainly not peaceful. Conflict soon enters. The younger gods disturb Apsu. He plans to destroy them. Aya, wise and cunning, acts first, defeating Apsu and establishing his dwelling upon the deep. This already tells us something important. Creation in this tradition does not unfold as calm unfolding. It advances through crisis, intelligence, and violence. The old powers do not step aside politely. They must be overcome, contained, or transformed. Then Tiamat rises. Popular imagination often reduces her to a dragon, but that is too simple. She is monstrous in the epic, yes, and she raises a terrifying army of chaotic beings. Yet she is also primeval, maternal, and older than the gods who oppose her. She is not just a beast outside creation. She is part of the origin from which the divine world itself has come. That makes her defeat unsettling. Order is born by turning against its own depth. The gods are frightened by her. They need a champion, and Marduk offers himself. But he does not fight for free. Before facing Tiamat, he demands supreme authority. If he defeats the chaos threatening the gods, then his command must be unmatched. His word must determine destiny. The divine assembly agrees. This is the central political moment of the myth. Marduk's kingship is not presented as an accident. It is negotiated under emergency conditions. The gods surrender authority to the one who can save them. In human terms, it resembles the logic by which crisis strengthens kingship. When danger becomes overwhelming, power gathers into the hands of the figure who promises victory. Marduk arms himself with winds, storm, net, bow, and irresistible force. His battle with Tiamat is cosmic combat, but it also feels like an enthronement ritual written in the language of violence. He defeats her, and then comes one of the most striking images in ancient mythology. He splits her body and uses it to construct the universe. From the defeated sea comes the architecture of heaven and earth. This detail should not be rushed. Marduk does not simply kill chaos and leave it behind. He builds with it. The enemy becomes material. The body of the older power is reorganized into the ordered world. That is a profound Mesopotamian idea. Civilization does not erase dangerous forces. It rearranges them into boundaries, functions, and names. The cosmos is made from what had threatened to overwhelm it. After victory, Marduk assigns places to the gods, establishes celestial order, organizes time, and receives exalted names. The story is not only about combat, it is about administration after combat. A warrior who cannot organize the peace is not enough. Marduk's greatness lies in both defeating Tiamat and arranging the universe afterward. He becomes king because he can transform crisis into structure. This is where Babylon enters the myth most clearly. Marduk's rise is also Babylon's rise. If Marduk is supreme among the gods, then his city is not merely another city. It becomes the earthly center of cosmic authority. Its temple, its rituals, its kings, and its political ambitions are wrapped in the language of creation itself. To honor Babylon is, in this worldview, to recognize the order established after the defeat of chaos. We should be careful here. The Enuma Elish does not preserve the earliest form of all Mesopotamian creation thought. It is a later Babylonian composition shaped by specific theological and political needs. Older gods like Anu, Enlil, and Ea are not erased, but their roles are reorganized so that Marduk can stand above them. That reorganization is the point. Myth becomes a way of rearranging divine prestige to match historical power. This is not unique to Babylon. Cities across Mesopotamia understood themselves through their gods. When political fortunes changed, divine narratives could change with them. A god's importance could expand with a city's empire. Theology could preserve memory, justify rule, and give cosmic depth to political reality. In Marduk's case, the scale is extraordinary because the myth does not merely say, Babylon is favored, and it says, in effect, that the universe itself bears the mark of Babylon's god. There is a danger in reading this too cynically. Ancient scribes were not simply public relations officers with reed styluses. They worked within a world where divine power was real to the culture that preserved these texts. Political theology does not mean false belief. It means that belief and power were joined so closely that separating them may tell us more about modern habits than ancient ones. The creation of humanity in Enuma Elish also fits this system. Humans are formed so that they may bear the labor of the gods, allowing divine beings to rest and receive service. The theme is familiar from Atrahasis, but here it is folded into Marduk's cosmic settlement. After chaos is defeated and the universe arranged, humanity takes its assigned place within the divine economy. We are not the climax of a love story. We are part of the maintenance plan. That phrase may sound dry, but it captures something essential. Mesopotamian creation is often about making the world workable. The gods need order, cities need gods, temples need offerings, kings need legitimacy, humans need survival. Myth binds these needs into one grand design, and Marduk stands at the point where force, law, and worship meet. The result is magnificent and unsettling. Babylon's god becomes king of the cosmos by defeating a primeval mother sea and building the world from her remains. The ordered universe is therefore not innocent. It is founded on conquest. Its beauty depends on a victory that is also a dismemberment. Its stability depends on the memory of what had to be subdued. That may be why the myth's power endured. It does not describe order as gentle. It describes order as something won, declared, organized, and defended. For an empire, this was useful theology. For human beings living under empire, it may also have sounded familiar. Peace often arrives wearing the armor of the victor. Marduk's rise marks a shift in the mythic landscape. The old divine hierarchy has not disappeared, but it has been recentered. The city has become cosmic. The temple has become an axis of reality. Creation itself has become a charter for Babylonian authority. And once myth can crown a city's god as ruler of the universe, it can also crown human kings as servants of that divine design. War, law, justice, conquest, ritual, and sacred kingship will no longer sit at the edges of mythology. They will stand openly in its center, where every city claims a god, every throne seeks heaven's approval, and every empire tries to make its ambition look eternal. Chapter 13: War Gods, City Gods, and Sacred Kingship. In Mesopotamia, a city was never only a city. It was a household of a god. That idea is easy to miss if we look at ancient ruins as piles of architecture, as walls and gates and temple platforms separated from the beliefs that gave them meaning. But for the people who lived there, a city's identity was inseparable from its divine owner. The god was not an emblem placed on the city like a modern flag. The god was the center of its life, the authority behind its laws, the receiver of its offerings, the power whose favor could make prosperity feel possible and whose abandonment could turn victory into dread. This is why Mesopotamian politics was always more than politics. To rule a city meant stepping into a sacred relationship already older than any king. A ruler could command armies, collect taxes, dig canals, and build walls. But he did so as a servant of powers greater than himself. Royal inscriptions often sound grand, and sometimes almost exhausting in their confidence. But beneath the boasting is a basic theological claim. The king rules because the gods have permitted him to rule. Without that permission, power becomes fragile. The city god gave a community its cosmic address. Nippur belonged especially to Enlil, whose authority made the city religiously prestigious even when political power shifted elsewhere. Ur was associated with Inanna, the moon god, whose calm light moved through the cycles of time. Sippar and Larsa honored Shamash, the sun god of justice, whose gaze could reveal what human beings tried to hide. Babylon rose with Marduk. Assur, in the north, gave his name and sacred force to Assyria, where divine kingship and imperial ambition would grow into something severe and world-shaping. Each city's god carried a particular personality and domain, but also a claim. To say that a god favored a city was to say that the city mattered in the order of things. Temples were not only places where people prayed. They were the god's residence, estate, treasury, and political heart. Offerings were not symbolic gestures in the thin modern sense. They were service. The god was clothed, fed, praised, housed, and honored through ritual care. A neglected god was a dangerous thought. This helps explain the intensity of temple building in Mesopotamian kingship. When rulers restored shrines, raised platforms, repaired sanctuaries, or brought divine statues into splendid spaces, they were not merely decorating the sacred landscape. They were proving their fitness to rule. A king who built for the gods showed that he understood his place. He was not above divine order. He was its chief human servant. And yet this service could become a language of domination. When empires expanded, They did not only seize land, they entered the divine geography of other cities. They captured statues, redirected offerings, imposed tribute, and claimed that the gods had transferred favor to the conqueror. The removal of a divine statue from a defeated city was not just theft. It could be interpreted as a catastrophe of presence, as though the god had departed or been taken into the custody of another power. This is one of the most unsettling aspects of Mesopotamian sacred politics. Divine favor was real, but it could appear mobile. A city might believe itself beloved, yet still fall. A king might claim the gods supported his campaign, and the victory itself would be offered as evidence. In defeat, the explanation might turn toward divine anger, neglected rituals, broken oaths, or destinies decreed beyond human appeal. The political world was read through sacred signs, and sacred signs were often read through political outcomes. War gods sharpened this logic. Ninurta, associated with warrior power, agriculture, and heroic combat, could represent the force that defends order by striking down threats. In myths and hymns, divine battle is often more than violence. It is the restoration of proper arrangement. The enemy becomes chaos, rebellion, mountain, monster, or disorder. Victory becomes not merely conquest, but correction. That language was powerful and also dangerous. Once a ruler can describe his enemies as cosmic disorder, war becomes easier to sanctify. Mesopotamian kings were not unique in this. Many cultures have wrapped ambition in sacred necessity. But in the Mesopotamian world, where gods owned cities and kings served divine plans, the union of warfare and theology could become especially intense. The battlefield was not only a contest between armies, it could be framed as a test of divine backing. Assyria later developed this into one of the ancient world's most formidable imperial visions. Ashur, the god of Assur, became bound to the expansion of Assyrian power. Royal campaigns could be described as obedience to Ashur's command. Conquest became service. Terror became policy with a sacred vocabulary. We should be cautious here. Royal inscriptions are not neutral reporting. They are crafted texts, designed to magnify kings and intimidate rivals. But even allowing for exaggeration, they show how deeply imperial violence could be embedded in divine mission. Shamash offers a different but equally important form of sacred authority. As sun god and judge, he was associated with justice, truth, and the revealing light that sees what is hidden. Law in Mesopotamia did not float free from religion. A king could present himself as the one who establishes justice under divine sanction. The famous image of a ruler receiving authority before a seated god captures the essential claim. Human law stands under heavenly witness. This does not mean justice was perfectly practiced. Ancient societies were hierarchical, unequal, and often harsh. The divine language of justice could coexist with slavery, conquest, debt, punishment, and royal self-interest. But the ideal still mattered. To claim Shamash's light was to claim that law should be more than private power. It should align, at least in principle, with an order no human ruler invented. Inanna, the moon god, reveals yet another dimension of divine life. The moon marked time, cycles, months, ritual calendars, and the measured passage of nights. In a world where agriculture, festivals, omens, and administration depended on timing, celestial regularity had sacred weight. The moon did not conquer like a storm god or judge like the sun. but its rhythm helped structure the life of cities. Not all divine power was loud. Some of it moved quietly across the sky, returning on schedule, teaching human beings to count. This variety matters. Mesopotamian religion was not a single mood of fear. It included terror, yes, but also order, beauty, calculation, legal aspiration, agricultural hope, and civic pride. The gods made the world heavy with obligation, but they also made it meaningful. To belong to a city was to belong to a divine story larger than one household or one lifetime. Sacred kingship stood at the crossing point of all these forces. The king was human, mortal, and limited. Yet he was also the one expected to maintain temples, protect canals, defeat enemies, sponsor rituals, uphold justice, and speak in the language of divine favor. He was both servant and center. That tension could never be fully resolved. If he succeeded, he looked chosen. If he failed, he looked abandoned. Perhaps this is why Mesopotamian kings tried so hard to write themselves into permanence. They carved their deeds into stone, buried foundation inscriptions beneath buildings, commissioned hymns, and placed their names before future readers. But the myths knew what royal inscriptions sometimes tried to outrun. Kings die. Cities fall. Gods may outlast their worshippers, but even their statues can be broken, stolen, buried, or forgotten. And still the system endured for millennia because it answered a powerful need. It told people that their city stood somewhere inside the cosmic order. It told rulers that their authority was not merely force. It told communities that law, war, grain, ritual, and time were connected. It made politics sacred, which gave power meaning, and made power more dangerous. In Mesopotamia, the gods did not remain in heaven. They owned fields, entered treaties, received meals, chose kings, abandoned cities, demanded temples, and marched in the language of armies. To live there was to inhabit a world where civic life was never purely human. And because the gods were so deeply woven into daily life, people searched constantly for signs of what those gods intended. A victory, a fever, a dream, an eclipse, a malformed birth, the movement of stars, any of these might carry a message. The divine world had spoken through kings and temples, but it also spoke in hidden patterns, and the task of the wise was to read danger before it arrived. Chapter 14. Omens, Demons, and the Hidden Language of the Gods. For the Mesopotamians, the universe was not silent. It could be difficult, frightening, contradictory, and painfully obscure, but it was not mute. The gods spoke through storms, dreams, stars, animals, illness, strange births, smoke, oil entrails, eclipses, and accidents that might look random to an untrained eye. The world was full of messages. The great problem was learning how to read them before the warning became disaster. This is where Mesopotamian thought becomes both deeply strange and deeply recognizable. We may no longer consult the liver of a sacrificed sheep before making state decisions, at least not in most offices with decent lighting. But the impulse behind divination is not hard to understand. People wanted to know what was coming. Kings wanted to know whether a campaign would succeed. Families wanted to know whether illness could be survived. Priests wanted to know which god had been offended, which ritual had failed, which hidden danger was already moving toward the house. Divination did not feel like curiosity. It felt like defense. Among the most important forms was extispacy, especially the reading of the liver. To Mesopotamian diviners, the liver was not merely an organ. It was a surface on which divine intention might be marked. Its shape, color, oddities, and divisions could be examined according to learned traditions. Clay models of livers were used in training, turning the body of an animal into a kind of sacred map. What looks to us like anatomical superstition was, within its own world, a disciplined art of interpretation. The logic was not that gods shouted plainly. They encoded. That distinction matters. Mesopotamian divination was scholarly in temperament. It collected precedents. It organized signs. It built massive omen series in which one event could be linked to a possible outcome. If a lunar eclipse occurred in a certain month, if a child was born with an unusual feature, if oil poured into water formed a particular pattern, if a dream contained a certain image, then perhaps a danger, victory, death, rebellion, famine, or royal crisis might follow. To modern readers, this can seem like a universe drowning in pattern. But for Mesopotamian experts, pattern was the point. A meaningless world is terrifying because nothing can be anticipated. A meaningful world is terrifying too, but at least it can be studied. The diviner stood between fear and knowledge, trying to transform anxiety into procedure. Astrology grew from the same hunger for order. The heavens were not empty decoration above human affairs. They were part of the divine writing system. The movement of planets, the timing of eclipses, the shape of the moon, the appearance of stars, all could carry significance. The sky became an archive of warning. Looking upward was not only wonder, it was surveillance in reverse. Human beings watched the heavens because they believed the heavens were watching history. This was especially important for kings. A bad omen concerning the ruler could threaten the whole state. If the king was the human hinge of divine order, then danger to him was danger to the land. Some rituals developed to manage such threats, including the remarkable practice sometimes called the substitute king ritual. Under certain ominous conditions, a substitute might temporarily occupy the royal role while the real king withdrew from danger. The logic is chilling and practical. If fate is aiming at the king, perhaps the target can be redirected. Here, theology meets political stagecraft in a way that feels almost theatrical. But the stakes were not pretend. Ritual could shift danger, absorb it, confuse it, or contain it. Whether the ritual worked in any physical sense is not the main historical point. It worked socially and religiously by giving a kingdom something to do when the signs suggested catastrophe. Action itself became a shield against helplessness. Dreams offered another channel. A dream might be a message from a god, a warning, a deception, or the troubling residue of illness and fear. Interpreting dreams required caution, because the inner life was not considered sealed off from divine influence. Night opened the mind to visitors. In sleep, a person could receive instruction, threat, reassurance, or confusion. The boundary between psychology and theology was porous. That porosity shaped the treatment of demons as well. Illness might involve natural symptoms, but it could also be understood as the work of hostile forces, ghosts, curses, divine anger, or ritual pollution. This did not mean Mesopotamians had no practical medicine. Healing could involve herbs, bandages, diagnosis, and physical treatment. But it could also involve incantations, amulets, purification, offerings, and exorcistic rites. The body was treated as both biological and spiritual territory. The exorcist or ritual specialist was not merely a dramatic figure waving away monsters in the dark. He was a learned professional working with inherited texts and procedures. He might identify a possessing force, recite incantations, prepare protective objects, perform washings, transfer impurity, or appeal to powerful gods for aid. The goal was not to create spectacle. The goal was restoration, to return the person, house, or community to a safer alignment. Protection mattered because danger was imagined as mobile. It could enter through a doorway, attach to a body, follow a family line, rise from improper burial, or arrive on the wind. Houses could be guarded with figurines and ritual deposits. Amulets could be worn. Incantation bowls, seals, images, and spoken formulas could create boundaries against forces that ordinary walls could not stop. Mesopotamian life was full of thresholds, and thresholds required attention. This is one reason the world can feel so crowded in Mesopotamian texts. Gods above, dead below, demons at the edges, omens in the sky, messages in dreams, signs in animals, warnings in the body. To live well was not simply to be brave or pious. It was to be observant. A careless person might walk past a warning already placed in plain sight. There is a temptation to treat all of this as fearfulness, and it certainly contains fear. But it also contains intellectual ambition. Mesopotamian scholars tried to catalog uncertainty. They did not shrug at disorder. They built archives against it. Their omen collections, rituals, and commentaries show an extraordinary confidence that the world could be read, even if reading it required generations of trained attention. The contradiction is striking. Their gods were unpredictable, yet their signs could be studied. Fate could be decreed, yet rituals might avert or soften it. Demons were frightening, yet they could be named. Dreams were unstable, yet interpretable. The future was hidden, but not always completely hidden. Mesopotamian religion lived inside that tension, between dread and method. And perhaps that is why it feels so human. We still search for patterns before disaster. We watch markets, weather systems, medical scans, political signals, satellite images, and small changes in the behavior of those we love. We tell ourselves we are more rational because our instruments have changed. Often we are, but the old anxiety remains familiar. Something may be coming, and someone must notice in time. The Mesopotamians built one of history's earliest and most elaborate cultures of noticing. Their priests and scholars listened to the world as if it were speaking in a language half revealed and half concealed. They knew that a sign misunderstood could be as dangerous as a sign ignored, so they watched the heavens, examined bodies, questioned dreams, and filled tablets with the grammar of possible doom. For them, the divine was not only worshipped in temples or praised in hymns, it was tracked, interpreted, negotiated with, feared in advance. And long after the gods themselves faded from living worship, many of their signs refused to vanish. Floods, cosmic battles, underworld journeys, monstrous guardians, sacred kings, divine judgment, and the dream of reading fate would travel beyond Mesopotamia into other traditions, changed by every culture that received them, but still carrying the faint shape of the world between the rivers. Chapter 15. the myths that refused to die. Mesopotamia's gods did not disappear all at once. They faded unevenly. A temple might lose its offerings. A city might be conquered. A statue might be carried away, restored, buried, or broken. A language might stop being spoken in the streets while still being copied by scholars. A myth might cease to be worship, but continue as literature, memory, or raw material for another culture's imagination. This is one of the strange afterlives of Mesopotamian mythology. The gods beneath the ruins did not remain powerful in the old way. No one now brings daily meals to Enlil in Nippur, or addresses Marduk as the living lord of Babylon in the manner of ancient temple ritual. But their stories did not simply die with their cults. They traveled, sometimes clearly, sometimes faintly, sometimes only as echoes that are difficult to prove. And here, caution is essential. It is easy to become too excited by resemblance. A flood story here, a dragon battle there, a descent into the underworld somewhere else, a hero seeking immortality, a divine council, a cosmic sea, a sacred mountain, a chaos monster defeated by a storm god. Once we begin looking, ancient mythologies seem to speak to one another across enormous distances. Sometimes they really do. Sometimes the connection is direct. Sometimes it is indirect, filtered through trade, conquest, scribal education, exile, translation, or shared Near Eastern tradition. And sometimes two cultures simply wrestled with similar human fears and produced similar shapes. The honest work is knowing the difference, or at least admitting when we cannot. The flood tradition is the clearest place to begin. Mesopotamian flood stories, preserved in Atrahasis and in the account told by Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, are older in written form than the biblical story of Noah. The similarities are too strong to dismiss. Divine decision, chosen survivor, great boat, animals, catastrophic waters, birds sent out, sacrifice after landing. But similarity does not mean sameness. The meaning changes. In Atrahasis, the flood is bound to overpopulation, noise, and the gods' need to manage humanity. In Genesis, the flood becomes a story of moral corruption, divine judgment, covenant, and renewal. That transformation matters. It shows us how myth survives by being reinterpreted. A story can carry older bones while receiving a new heart. Creation myths followed a similar path of transformation, though often less directly. Mesopotamian thought imagined watery beginnings, divine conflict, separation, naming, and the organizing of the world from unstable depths. Later traditions across the Near East also speak of primeval waters, divine ordering, and the defeat or control of chaos. Scholars continue to debate the exact lines of influence in particular cases, and we should not pretend every resemblance can be mapped with certainty. But the cultural environment was shared enough that ideas about cosmic water, divine kingship, and chaos subdued by order could move and be reshaped. The combat myth is especially persistent. Marduk defeating Tiamat belongs to a wider ancient pattern in which a champion god establishes order by overcoming a sea or dragon-like force. Later echoes appear in different forms across Near Eastern and Mediterranean traditions. Storm gods against sea powers, divine warriors against serpents, order rising through battle. These stories do not all come from one simple source, but they belong to a family of imagination in which the world is never peacefully guaranteed. it must be one. That idea proved remarkably durable. The underworld journey also refused to vanish. Inanna's descent is one of the oldest and most powerful surviving stories of a divine figure entering the realm of death, being stripped of power and returning only through strict conditions. Later myths from other cultures would tell of gods, heroes, lovers, and musicians who cross into death's territory and attempt return. We should be careful with direct claims. Not every descent story is borrowed from Inanna, but her myth shows how ancient and sophisticated the pattern already was in Mesopotamia. Descent as loss, death as law, return as exchange, love as something that cannot escape the underworld without consequence. The figure of the hero searching for life beyond death also endured. Gilgamesh is not exactly the ancestor of every later wandering hero, but his anguish feels startlingly recognizable. A powerful man loses someone he loves, fears his own death, seeks an exception, receives wisdom, fails to secure immortality, and returns to the works of human life. Later literature would return again and again to this shape. The journey outward that becomes a journey inward, the quest that fails at the surface and succeeds only by changing the seeker's understanding. What makes Gilgamesh so enduring is not that he finds the answer. It is that he does not. The myth survives because the failure is true. Mesopotamian influence also moved through scribal culture. Cuneiform scholarship lasted for millennia. Texts were copied, translated, adapted, archived, and studied across changing empires. Sumerian stories could live on in Akkadian versions. Babylonian works could circulate beyond Babylon. Assyrian libraries could preserve myths older than Assyria's own imperial moment. This long scribal afterlife gave Mesopotamian mythology a peculiar durability. The stories were not passed down only by campfire memory. They were taught by hands trained to reproduce signs with care. Of course, preservation did not mean stability. Every copy is also a historical event. A scribe chooses, learns, misreads, repairs, updates, omits, or preserves. A myth copied in a royal library may carry different weight than a myth told in a local cult. A broken tablet may make one episode seem more mysterious than it once was. What reaches us is not Mesopotamian mythology as a complete living system. It is mythology after damage, filtered through the accidents of survival. Still, its themes moved far. The divine council appears in later religious imagination in altered forms. The sacred king chosen by heaven becomes part of royal ideology across many lands. Omens and astrology influenced later traditions of reading the heavens. Demons, protective figures, and ritual words traveled through Near Eastern religious practice, changing names and meanings as they moved. Even when specific gods disappeared, their functions could reappear under other names. The Stormbringer, the Wise Craftsman, the Underworld Queen, the Warrior of Order, the Dangerous Goddess of Desire. This is not theft in the simple sense. Ancient cultures were not sealed museums. They touched constantly through trade, migration, war, diplomacy, exile, marriage, slavery, scholarship, and empire. Stories crossed borders because people did. A myth might be carried by a captive, a merchant, a priest, a court scribe, or a tablet placed in a library by someone who never imagined a modern scholar would read it under electric light. There is also a deeper reason these myths survived. They asked questions that later cultures could not stop asking. Why is the world unstable? Why do rulers need divine approval? Why does civilization require violence? Why do humans work and die? Why does love lead us toward grief? Why does water create and destroy? Why do we search for signs before catastrophe? Why does every city, however proud, eventually become vulnerable? Mesopotamia's answers were not always comforting. Often they were severe. Humans were made for labor. The gods were powerful, but not reliably gentle. Death was not a doorway into reward, but a dim land of dependency. Kingship was sacred, yet mortal. Order was precious, yet built against forces that never fully vanished. Perhaps that severity is why the myths still feel alive. They do not flatter us. They do not promise that wisdom cancels fear. They do not pretend that civilization is pure light. They tell us that clay can become a city, a tablet, a prayer, or a ruin, depending on what time and power decide to do with it. And so the myths refused to die because they were never only about Mesopotamia. They were about the human condition seen through river mud, temple smoke, royal ambition, and the dread of gods whose motives could not always be trusted. Their names changed. Their temples fell. Their languages retreated into scholarship. But the shapes remained: flood, descent, monster, king, omen, underworld, creation from chaos. The hero who cannot live forever. The old gods lost their worshippers, but not all of their questions. Chapter 16. The Silence of the Tablets. For thousands of years, the gods of Mesopotamia lay unread. Not dead in the ordinary sense, because gods do not leave bones. Not alive in the old sense either, because no priest was waking them with hymns, feeding them in temples, or carrying their statues through festival streets. They existed in a stranger condition, trapped in signs that almost no one could understand. Clay held them. That is one of the great ironies of Mesopotamian history. A civilization so vulnerable to flood, invasion, fire, and collapse preserved its deepest stories on one of the humblest materials imaginable. Clay could break. Clay could be buried. Clay could be scattered across ruins. But when fired by accident, by destruction itself, it could also endure with astonishing stubbornness. Palaces burned. Libraries fell. Cities emptied. And inside the wreckage, tablets hardened into witnesses. When modern archaeology began pulling these fragments from the ground, it did not recover a complete mythology waiting politely in order. It recovered damage, broken corners, missing lines, duplicate versions that did not always agree, names without full stories, stories without endings, lists, hymns, omens, prayers, royal inscriptions, school exercises, and epics copied by hands long gone. The rediscovery of Mesopotamian mythology was therefore not a single dramatic unveiling. It was a slow act of listening to a shattered archive. Cuneiform scholarship changed everything. Once the script could be read, the buried cities began to speak in ways no ruin could manage alone. The tablets revealed that the ancient Near East had possessed a literary and religious imagination of immense age and complexity. The flood was older than many had assumed. Gilgamesh stepped out of clay as one of the world's great tragic figures. Inanna descended again. Marduk rose again. Enki whispered warnings again. Ereshkigal kept her throne below. But the recovered myths also taught humility. We do not possess Mesopotamian religion as its worshippers lived it. We possess what survived, often elite, scribal, fragmentary, and uneven. Many voices are missing. The farmer's private fear, the mother's whispered prayer, the laborer's doubt, the ordinary mourner's memory. These are harder to hear than the king's inscription or the trained scribe's copy. The tablets are astonishing, but they are not everything. That limitation matters. It keeps us from turning Mesopotamia into a fantasy of perfect ancient wisdom or pure darkness. Its myths are neither simple superstition nor secret truth waiting to be decoded for modern use. They are human documents from cultures that tried to understand power, nature, death, labor, kingship, desire, and catastrophe through the language of gods. And the gods they imagined were not gentle decorations. They were vast, demanding, sometimes wise, sometimes frightening, often morally difficult. They created humans to work. They sent floods. They guarded cosmic order with violence. They spoke through signs that required experts to interpret. They allowed kings to rise and cities to fall. They did not always comfort, but they explained why comfort was so hard to trust. That may be the final insight these broken tablets offer. Mesopotamian myth is not a museum of strange old beliefs. It is a record of people living in a world where survival depended on fragile systems, canals, harvests, walls, rulers, rituals, memory. They knew order could fail. They knew power could turn. They knew death was not persuaded by greatness. Their mythology did not erase those fears. It gave them form. The gods vanished from worship, but the questions remained. Why do we build, knowing everything built can fall? Why do we seek signs before disaster? Why does power need a story to justify itself? Why does grief make mortality suddenly real? Why do human beings, made from ordinary earth, keep trying to leave something less ordinary behind? Mesopotamia answered in clay. And perhaps that is why these myths still hold us. Not because we live beneath Anu's heaven or bring offerings to Enlil's temple, but because we still recognize the trembling line between order and ruin. We still know what it means to depend on forces we cannot fully control. We still build our cities beside waters that may rise. The tablets are silent until someone reads them. Then, for a moment, the buried world returns, not whole, not healed, not fully understood, but present. A civilization lost its gods. The clay kept their shadows,